My name is Ira Shore. I'm a professor emeritus from the City University of New York Graduate Center. I just retired after 48 years in CUNY, and I spent most of my time in the City University trying to develop a liberating pedagogy, empowering pedagogy, based on the work of Paulo Freire, with whom I wrote a book in the 1980s called A Pedagogy for Liberation, where we had a dialogue book. And I was a student in the 60s, very involved in the anti-war movement and civil rights movement and the emergence of the women's rights movement, then with the April 22nd, when the Earth Day started. So like many young people at the time, it was a great time to be young, because it suddenly seemed like so much was happening and so much was possible. And it was so thrilling to be surrounded by thousands and thousands of people your age who were determined that a better world was possible, and that we were actually going to make it happen, and that we could end the ugly, illegal war in Vietnam, which was costing so many lives of the Vietnamese and American soldiers, and that we could stop the pollution of the earth and save our planet, that we could end the ugly racism that had tormented America for so many centuries. We thought we were going to join together as white folks and folks of color, and we had a chance now to march together and be instrumental in making this ugliness end, and that we were beginning to recognize what patriarchy was all about, and how male supremacy was another distortion of happy human relations, and very unjust. We had to do something about that. So it was a time when there was so much to do and so much to learn, and we were all growing as fast as we could, but we were all very, very young and immature, and we really lacked adult supervision. So there were very few grown-ups around, adults, who could help us put things in perspective and teach us. So if we found an older professor, we all sat there and listened. There were a handful. So mostly we were on our own. So there was a lot of anti-war activity, of course, in Madison, Wisconsin, where I went to graduate school. I also took part in the first teach-in, I believe, that happened in I believe it was March or April of 1965 in Michigan and Berkeley, where we had an all-night anti-war teach-in that began the teach-in movement. So I was there, and it was also very exciting. People came out very late at night, and professors joined us. It was very nice. Very thrilling to feel part of movements, mass movements. So, it's over the time. The other things happened, and I took part in the formation of the Teaching Assistants Association in 1969, which was the first graduate teaching union of assistants in America. And we led, I was the police marshal for our 5 or 6 week strike in the spring of 1970. We went on strike, and we were demanding a good contract and so on, like labor folks do. And that happened in the spring of, our strike was in the spring of 1970, just before the terrible, terrible massacre at Kent. So anti-war activity was happening, but so was all this other stuff was going on too. So it was the stage of history was very busily crowded from below. All kinds of people who were crowding the stage of history from below, demanding their rights. Okay, let my phone end, and then
wait, it's all good. It's no worries.
All right. So
so back to May 4th.
Right. So it was a very busy time, and so I was in the middle of a very important long-term strike, and we were having to decide what to negotiate, what to do, how to blockade doors, and this and that. Then the invasion of Cambodia suddenly erupted, and the Nixon administration was escalating the war in a very dramatic way. And of course, we as the anti-war movement, we couldn't sit still with this eruption. So a whole new round of anti-war protests also cycled in. And in the middle of all of it, the terrible, terrible news arrived. drive from Kent that 4 students, Allison, Sandy, Jeff, and Bill, had been murdered, and 9 others had been shot and were badly injured. And we were all in shock. It was terrible. It was hard to believe that such an atrocity could happen. And we knew that those students were not armed and were not a danger to the guardsmen, who were very well armed and so on. So there was a great deal of anger and outrage and sadness and disbelief and so on. So like many campuses around the country, several hundred campuses in America went on strike at that time. And there were student strikes, hundreds of places all around the nation. And Madison was one of those places. And for several nights, it was a war zone. And the police were they did not shoot, they did not fire weapons, but they did fire an enormous amount of tear gas. So the whole area was very, very toxic as you ran through it and got your eyes and your skin burned and this and that. So that went on for a few nights. And then when it was over, it was the mailboxes had been ripped off their foundations, and garbage cans from the streets were thrown all over the place, and windows of various stores had been smashed and so on. So things looked like a war zone in response to the Kent State massacre and also to the invasion of Cambodia. So, of course, this was a tremendous moment for all of us. And the campus at Madison had been several times and was again occupied by National Guardsmen. And this time they showed up in very large numbers and stood guard with drawn bayonets on their rifles. So it was more ominous than it had been before. And, it just was very, very trying, very, very, very difficult. So I think that was like a very widespread experience for all us young people who were involved in the movements of the time. And it left an indelible memory and an unforgettable mark on our character, that we were now living in a society ready to murder its own citizens, especially its young people who were in opposition, which had gotten to the point where the status quo could no longer tolerate the level of opposition it was facing. It had been on the defensive in the civil rights movement, and it was on the defensive in the anti-war movement. And now we had a rising Chicano movement. We had a rising ecology movement. And so this was a very dangerous time for the status quo and the powers that be. And they were readying their own offensive, to take their offensive. And in some ways, the terrible crime, this massacre at Kent State, was like the curtain opening on like the Empire Strikes Back. And now, we would have to deal with a much more aggressive status quo. So I think we took away that memory, and we understood that there was a deeper seriousness, a greater consequence to these undertakings. I honestly don't think it wasn't a very playful time, although because of the rock and roll that time, drugs, sex, and rock and roll, there remained from the 60s a very party atmosphere. I think that played a good role and a bad role at the same time. It sort of was very appealing and a way in which to take a breather, enjoy, and also at the same time was didn't quite face up to the adult seriousness of the undertaking. So it was a balance of things. So the year after Kent State, I got my PhD, and like many people in my generation, I was unemployed because one of Nixon's policies was called the cold bath at that time, which is to throw a cold bath on what they thought was a runaway economy, which also had the collateral advantage of taking a whole generation of young people like ourselves and suddenly putting us into economic difficulty of not having no jobs and no income and no way to earn a living or support ourselves. So we then had to make this transition from college to adult life, and also from school work to job market work. We had to find a job. And then after being crowded in all the college towns where there were so many of us and we were a critical mass of opposition, we suddenly were dispersed all over the place. So I had a very close relationship with about 8 or 10 teaching assistants in the English PhD program that I was part of. We studied for our prelims, our doctoral prelims together as a group, and so on. They decided that they were going to move as a group, as a collective, to Baltimore, and just try to continue as a group because they worked well together. So lots of young folks decided that they were going to move either to the land or to urban areas or into factories and try to continue a level of activity in a wholly different circumstance. That the times changed very quickly because of the site was, in a sense, dispersed once we all began to graduate and leave the campus because there was no support there. So first I was unemployed, and then by chance I happened to get a job in the City University of New York in 1971. So I started my 48-year career as an educator, as an English educator. And while I had a PhD in literature, I discovered when I got there that I was teaching working class urban students, primarily white at first, and that the problem was not literature or literary interest. The problem was literacy and the way in which language was used against them and about them, and the way in which they were using reading and writing and language skills. So I began to experiment, and I became very involved over the next decades in experimenting with what I call critical literacy and critical pedagogy, and eventually got to work with the Brazilian theorist Paulo Freire and write a book together with him. But it was a very busy time where some of us were very lucky to find a really difficult task that had a mass base and an institutional setting in which we could continue to be oppositional. And that was very fortunate. I felt very lucky. And then the battle over free tuition and open admissions at the City University of New York began, and it was a 5-year struggle where there was constant rallies, teach-ins, marches, protests, petitions, going on and on to try to defend the open access of working class New Yorkers to the City University, to defend our budget, and also to insist that free tuition, this landmark policy that was so extremely valuable to lower income students, that it had to stay in place. We fought for 5 years, tooth and nail, and we lost that battle in 1976. So I was very involved in there with that, with a lot of other young people who came out of the 60s and were involved in the same anti-war movements of the time and so on. So after feeling that in April 1975, when Saigon fell, we felt that we had won in stopping the anti-war movement at terrible cost to American soldiers, and 58,000 dead, 1,300 American nurses killed in Vietnam, 1 million Vietnamese killed. And then we had to add in lives such as the 4 people who were killed at Kent State. There was a terrible cost. But in 75, we forced an end to the war. And it was a great time to feel like in our youth, we took risks, and we had forced the status quo to retreat. And then at the same time, the status quo struck back and began a whole different campaign to retake control of its own society. And I wrote about this in a book called Culture Wars. It came out in the middle of the 80s to study how the tables were turned on the movements of the 60s, and how what I call the conservative restoration was initiated and organized by the folks from the top. So, but then we have to remember that at the same time, the opposition never sleeps. It's like rust. And that we had in the 70s the beginning of a very vigorous anti-war movement and a movement in favor of solar power. And I remember marching at various nuclear plants in the end of the 70s to get them to shut down. And then in the 1980s, there began a very, very serious gay movement to demand treatment for the AIDS crisis, and then to demand gay rights, and that continued for the next 20 years. So it's important to remember that in the middle of the empire striking back and using its formidable resources to regain control of all institutions of society, that opposition remained. And many of us who came out of the anti-war movement and who mourned those who were shot and murdered at Kent State, that we continued for the last 50 years to try to make a difference and try to continue opposition and build a just society. The mass media has chosen not to highlight us or to study us or to make it apparent to all of us just how many of us are busily at work from continuing opposition and building the just world that many of us imagined in 1970 when we were very, very young. And we have made progress. We've built an environmental movement that's international. It's international now. We also had some very strenuous oppositions to both Iraq wars in the 90s and then after 2003 that stood in the way of them becoming other Vietnams. And then there was this phenomenon of Occupy that erupted in September of 2011. And eventually about 700 American cities saw occupations of various kinds, as well as places all around the world. And it changed the language, the discourse of our society. We now routinely talk about the 1% and the 99%. And we have a meme that allows us quickly to indicate who's responsible for the troubles that we have and for a society that is looting the national wealth for the favor of the 1% at the top and keeping us all frozen at the bottom in declining conditions. Why are we so unprepared for this pandemic? Why are so many of our fellow Americans unemployed and also homeless? 100,000 children every year in New York City experience homelessness, school children. That's what the toll is here. So we've learned a lot, and we have a new language. So look, I trace it all back to that time when sadly we lost lots of people in various ways, and the four beautiful young people at Kent State. But they laid a foundation that many of us never forgot, and that many of us are determined to continue.
Well, Ira, I think that you've covered actually, most of the questions in terms of the breadth of it, in terms of your narrative. So I don't feel the need to be rote about it and specifically go back and word the questions. I mean, I think you followed what happened at May 4, 1970. You definitely have talked about how it's influenced our collective from then to now. And I think also I'm hearing you're saying that the thread of this resistance continues.
Yes, it's continued. It's part of our positional DNA that we are now the same bloodline, and we're just 50 years older, and a whole new generation, 2 generations have emerged under us, and they will inherit that DNA.
Well, I was born in 1970, about 7 or so odd months before. After what happened at Kent State, and went on to get degrees in history and actually ended up studying it. And something interesting, I ended up going into higher education and teaching like yourself, and I was curious to your thought about this, since you lived through that time period. I did not. When I was in grad school, and I had the good pleasure of having some really talented PhDs from UC Santa Barbara and Columbia and some other places, you got out, you got your PhD, and there were jobs, some jobs,
Yeah. Yes.
Certainly in the 80s, by then, 90, there were some jobs. So I had the fortune of having a lot of folks that had, kind of lived through that period. But the curious thing is that when I chose the topic that I wanted to write about, the way in which Kent State was being commemorated or remembered, and the way that narrative was being controlled, right? You mentioned how there were forces throughout the 80s into the 90s that were trying to turn the tables, right? And I remember being told by a couple of my advisors that Kent State wasn't history. It was more it was more sociology or politics or something of that nature. And so I guess I was one of those strange interdisciplinary people, you know, even though I had my formal training in history. To me, it was the very definition of history. It happened before I was here. And so I just had a burning
Great.
curiosity as to what was going on right before I got here, and what was the world like, and how did it get that way. And
Yeah.
so when I went back and started to uncover Kent, I really saw, you know, kind of laid bare the struggle, you know, the pain, the things that people fought for. And I just thought it was really important for me to do my really, really, really small part in trying to keep that memory not only alive, but in my view, the right memory, the correct, the true kind of story at Kent State about how, you know, those young people were murdered for speaking out against imperialism. And I think that for me, that spoke volumes. And I think that that's one of the lessons that I think we could take into the present is
Yes.
we're under this current pandemic crisis. And, you know, in other words, in our country's history, we always use war metaphors, right? The war on drugs, the war on sex, the war on coronavirus. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. Do you think we'll ever transcend the war metaphor and start looking at things in terms of, I don't want to be just, you know, simplistically binary by talking about peace versus war, but, you know, metaphorically, there's a lot of other ways to look at these movements that can be very helpful to us in the present, not just you and I now, but my kids and, you know, people's grandkids and people that are growing up in this crisis now.
Yes.
How do you maybe see that people are going to move that forward?
So, you know, Foucault spoke about disqualified discourses,
Mm-hmm.
and that the job of critical intellectuals, that one of our jobs was to unearth buried narratives. That's how he put it.
Mm-hmm.
That the narratives which tell the whole story of what happened at any time are always filtered and censored and so on, and what circulates as what he called the discourse of truth, or the dominant discourse, is always controlled by the state, by whoever controls the status quo. So all the rest of us who are in the opposition, we have to find all the narratives that are hidden, that are buried, that are disqualified, that the language we're not allowed to say, to research the incidents that are considered off bounds and so on. And that's a very important. It's a very important task, because it keeps memory alive. And as long as memory is kept alive, then we have something to focus on and think about and understand as the difference between where we are and where we have to go. So, you know, I think that in the last 50 years that many of us have been marginalized by the status quo. So look, here's one experience that we're able to produce, to unbury these narratives and to recover these disqualified discourses. We're able to produce them, but we have trouble circulating them. The circulation is the problem. Circulation means that we don't control mass media. We don't control state departments of education that set the curriculum for what should be studied. So I'm wearing the T-shirt of the Zen education movement, which is one attempt to really deal with this problem of censored circulation. That what topics, what contents, what subject matters are we allowed to raise? Not only that, but then how are we allowed to talk about them? So, for example, if you talk about the war on drugs, so drugs is being mentioned, the content, the subject matter of drugs is being mentioned, but it's being mentioned from the point of view of the top down. And by using war metaphors, it distracts us from the wars that we were involved in 50 years ago. We're involved in a war against racism. We're involved against a war against sexism. We're involved against the war against the environment, and so on and so on. So when the war metaphor is now seized by the establishment, it tries to tell us whose soldiers we should be in what way, and in what way we should look and how we should act in that war. So it's makes sense that we're constantly coming across these fake establishment wars, war on poverty that was never ended, war on drugs that are in great circulation, and so on, war on hunger that has only 500,000 people every night, food and cigarettes, so on. So those are fake wars to create the illusion of justice and so on. I think that in the current what we had 50 years ago that we have to work hard for in the next period is consolidation. That is, there is so much opposition now in so many dimensions. There's the Me Too. In education, there's so much disregard for the testing industry and for the invasion of high tech to steal the local school budgets, and the racist tracking that established the school to prison pipeline and so on. So there's so much opposition that if we added it all together, it would be a very formidable mass movement. We're not yet all facing together, even though we are all moving in the same direction. We're not moving together in the same direction. So if that begins to emerge, and I call it consolidation in the next period, we're going to see a whole lot. Now, one inkling of this came from Occupy 10 years ago, when this group took over a park in the Wall Street area of New York City. And then in the ensuing weeks, 700 other cities saw occupations, so that there was something waiting to happen, and so on. And now we have opposition growing in so many dimensions that it was all consolidated for a time under Bernie Sanders' campaign. That he was, as Noam Chomsky said, Bernie Sanders was anathema to the elite, not because he ran for president, but because he built an oppositional movement, mm-hmm. which was broadcasting disqualified discourses about class inequality, class oppression, the school to prison pipeline, the need for a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, and the scandal of the healthcare system and so on. He was talking about forbidden topics in forbidden ways. And that's why he was forced out of the campaign. But he demonstrated that it's possible to get a movement going around these ideas.
And Ira, sure, the movement in that direction is still there, just despite the fact that, I mean, I wouldn't say that Bernie's the head of the movement. He certainly didn't see himself that way either. But I think it's very poignant that you point out that movement is, we are moving in that direction. We're not necessarily together yet, but I think that the inertia is there, and to think that you can simply cut off what isn't even the head and think the movement's going away. One thing that the pandemic is doing is it's laid bare the failures of neoliberalism, which you've fought against your whole life.
Absolutely right, and that matters now. That the words neoliberalism and socialism are in circulation like never before in the last 40 years, mm-hmm. and that's a real accomplishment. It's a political accomplishment of the opposition. So what we have to do now is keep going and follow through, and then find each other and develop a lot of patience and tolerance for our differences, because all these groups that come together are going to have different identities. They're going to be from different locales. They'll be involved in different work. They'll be from different genders and so on, and different colors. And so we have to be very patient with how we develop a dialogue that brings us closer. And that's an adult job that we're capable of now, I think.
Yeah. Well, I agree, Ira, and I have to say it's been an honor to talk to you today.
Thank you. It's so nice. Thanks for calling. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate your insights, not just on Kent, but taking it up to the present for us, and even shining a brighter light into the future. Because, when I look, I'm very privileged to be around a lot of young people and teach college, and I look at them, and I just feel like I have a really big responsibility to try to at least leave something for them to grab onto and pave some way for them to have a better life.
That's right.
And I'm doing the best I can, and I appreciate people like you and certainly Henry Giroux and so many people that I've had the pleasure to learn from and eventually meet in my life. And it's just an honor to try to carry those torches forward.
So look, I hope you keep in touch. Okay, I'd like to hear more news from you. What do you say?
Absolutely, Ira, will do. And if you want to shoot me your physical mailing address, and you can disinfect packages if they come, I'm happy to send you a few books.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot. So I'm very happy to talk to you. So let's be in touch, okay?
Thanks, Ira.
You bet. Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
My name is Joel Ice, spelled E-I-S, pronounced like I-C-E. It's all they gave me was 3 letters. Amazingly enough, it's the same name as my parents. Back in the day, as you can tell, I'm old enough to have been there. Back in the day, when all this happened, I was when the things happened in Kent State and Jackson State, Mississippi. I was deeply involved in politics at the time, in radical political politics. I lived in Fresno, California, which most people go right by and say, "Oh, let's stop somewhere else." At that particular period of time, it was more important than one would think. Certainly more than its geographical importance. For some reason. First of all, it had been a union organizing center for the grape strike. The Farm Workers Theater was there. I was a member of Farm Workers Theater. I was the production manager and an actor in the company at that time. I knew Luis Valdez even from before he started the company. We knew each other in college. So I was deeply involved in radical theater and radical politics there, running from the cops, trying to finish the play in the park, which is what that was about. I was deeply involved with the draft movement. I lived at the Draft Resistance House at the time. So Fresno was an epicenter for that because there was also, California only had 3 induction centers, one in San Diego and one in Oakland, one in LA, I think, one in Oakland, and one for some reason in Fresno, which was in the Central Valley, geographically spread out. But that made us pretty much ground zero for a lot of stuff. We would leave in front of the induction center, which was right there. The press was always there. David Harris, who started the National Draft Resistance, and Mary Joan Baez was from Fresno, California. I actually was a friend of his in high school. By pure chance, all of these confluence of things had happened. So being deeply involved in the grape strike and deeply involved in that and political politics on the campus, which was a very important. I won't go into that, but there were some big issues at Fresno State at the time, which became benchmarks for rights, civil rights, academic rights of freedom of speech. We found ourselves at a whirlwind center, not of our making, not of our choosing, at the time that this went on. And I remember distinctly that day or that period. There was a march. We organized a march from the free speech area from Fresno State out to the main street of town, and we had over 2,000 people there. I was on the podium with other people, led the march, went out through the street. On that particular period of time, there were something like 800 or 900 colleges in America that went out on strike within a day or so of the bombing of Cambodia and the murders of Kent and Jackson State. We had about 2,000 people, which means if there were 900 campuses, they had an average of something like, they said, over 1 million people went on strike in the colleges. So we had double the average at Fresno, which tells you how active that area was. It was a very conservative area of agricultural students, farmers' kids, fraternities were a big deal there. And to get students, young people in that community, in that environment, that concern will show you how much of an upheaval that situation was. So that was where I was at that particular moment in time.
Right, May 4, 1970. So you were deeply involved in those various civil rights movements, anti-war movements.
Oh yeah.
So
up to here, I'm telling you.
Yeah, well, it sounds like that's sort of maybe been a thread then through your life. So how has the May 4, 1970 Kent State massacre influenced the collective of our society, maybe from then to now?
Good question.
Yeah.
It's really it's hard to describe to people who weren't there what that was like. They all get these ideas that it was it was only paisley clothes and music and free-flowing drugs and women in gossamer outfits. And I won't say that wasn't there, but I will say for people involved in politics, that was a side issue. All of those things were part of a cultural revolution, which was a result of the bankruptcy of our values and how those values were being acted out by the dominant society. That became personal, family by family. In my case and many other people, my dad was in World War II. He had no concept that the government could do anything except defend the country. Now he grew up in a leftist household. I grew up in third generation leftist household. Nonetheless, he went to war and defended the country, and he just could not wrap his mind around the reality that that we were being used. The worst thing to tell an American was that they're being used. They'd rather shoot you than admit they were being used, which is exactly what happened at Kent State and Jackson State. I came home one day and my dad said to me, "If you burn your draft card, you're no son of mine." So I got up and walked away from the table and didn't talk to him for over a year thereafter. This was a family by family kind of civil war, cultural revolution. To put it in context in terms of the degree to which the average American mind was separated and disconnected from the reality they were facing. We had these things at the time called the hard hat riots. These were ordinary, working class people, working guys, were so upset at the hippies that they were, not going to work and taking their tax money and all the rest of this stuff, that they would go out and spontaneously beat the crap out of anybody with long hair. It was becoming a bit of a national sport. The odd thing is that you would stop any one of these guys individually and they'd say, well, I want my kids to have a better life than I did. I want them to go to college. Then when their kid would go to college and come home and tell them all the things their government hadn't told them about the realities of the world they were living in, they'd throw the kid out of the house. So they couldn't connect the value of the size of information that was coming into people at university as the other side of the information they weren't getting from the national media. They just couldn't accept the fact that they were being used. Most Americans don't realize that in those days, all the news that came into the newspapers went through the State Department first. It went to the State Department, then went out on the wire service. If the State Department didn't want you to see it, they just ripped it off the wire, and the newspapers never got it. The only way you could get that information was by reading the foreign press, the Guardian or the Manchester Guardian or the French Liberation papers, those kinds of things. And that was the source of that information at the time. So we were getting that information because we knew we were not getting the truth from our government. If you went back and told your dad that was what was happening, he threw you out of the house. Okay. Now, so we had a class distinction in terms of a generational distinction. In terms of Kent State and the university situation, you had working class kids going to the school and you had other people. So on the one hand, you had a person who would say, I want my kids to go to college, but they didn't want to hear what college kids were telling them about the realities that were going on at the time. They couldn't face it. They couldn't handle it. So you had guys at Kent State, you had guys at the other schools that were cops, that were National Guardsmen, that couldn't stand the fact that they'd been to Nam or that one of their friends was at Nam, and that they were being used. The veterans movement of men who were coming back from Vietnam, telling the realities, was getting the headlines at the time, and they were turning to their buddies in the National Guard and saying, you know, hey, Frank, what you read on the recruiting poster is in fact wrong. I was there. I was in the trenches. That's not what's going on, you know, and they couldn't handle that. So the reality of what the war was about and the reality of their own, the student population informing them that they were being used was becoming more and more pressured. And as anybody knows who's gone into an argument with somebody who's about to be proven wrong, that's when they get really intense. And that was what was happening. Problem is, these guys were armed with rifles and really intense. And they were believing what were being told. They couldn't face that fact. And at that moment, we knew something was going to give because there were more police arrests and all the rest of that stuff going on. And it blew at Kent State, which was literally in the physical middle of the country. It was a middle ground college. They considered it safe. They didn't expect this kind of thing to happen. They figured it would happen at Berkeley or Columbia, you know, or one of those places. So the fact that it happened at a school of such a supposedly safe common denominator indicates the depth and the level at which the government was completely disconnected with the mindset of the people. Most of the students in that demonstration didn't even realize that they were being taken that seriously by the other side. The idea that they would be shot at was something they really couldn't accept. Of course, if you were a black person in America at that time, getting shot at was pretty normal. I mean, the number of black people killed in that same week by police violence across the country was probably, you know, double or triple. I don't remember the newspapers, but getting shot at was pretty common. The first time that I had a gun pulled on me at a demonstration was in 1968 at the strike at San Francisco State, which was the biggest, most violent strike in the country. It was the strike for third world rights for the ethnic studies program. And you came to campus that day, and you came to campus on the days of the strike. There were 600 police officers. They had huge billy clubs. The first time that the cops ever had huge billy clubs. They came through the campus on horses, beating people up, literally on horseback. This was like Cossacks in World War I. On the roof of the building were police officers with machine guns, you know. So this was the way you were supposed to go to college, right? Same cops on the roof with the machine guns who were calling us, you know, irresponsible students, were putting their money away so their kid could go to college. You figure it, right? So this is the kind of clusterfuck they were dealing with. Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty, yeah, the contradictions are pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's what that world was like, was that the righter we became, the more information that came out that made it clear that the Vietnam War was a colonialist grab, the more intense was the reaction of trying to shut us up. There was a report, if I could just wax historical for a moment. There was a report that came out in the 50s done by Shell Oil, which is a Dutch oil company, put out by the French, which we were never shown until the 70s. That report, which was given to the federal government, showed that there were huge oil reserves in the China Sea off Vietnam, and huge reserves of iron ore and uranium in the mountains of Vietnam. That's what the war was about. We never saw that information. We were told it was about democracy. No, it was about the grabbing national resources before the Chinese could get in there. And that was it.
Well, Joel Ice, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Amen.
I mean, here we are in the 21st century, 50 years after the Kent State massacre.
Perfect.
So how does one, this is an interesting question, and
how do you bridge the gap? How do you cross the time?
Yeah, well, a lot of people have, you know, interpreted this differently, making peace with the Kent State massacre, so to speak. But, you know, as you clearly just laid out the reasoning behind Vietnam, we've seen one invasion after another, one issue after another. Right. All the wars of after 9/11 were allegedly to stop terrorism, but again, look at the countries that we've been invading. It's about natural resources, geopolitical location. So, but how do we make peace with what happens at something like Kent State? Political and human rights are still under assault. What are some lessons maybe to take from history?
Let me give you a wind up to the pitch. After the end of the Vietnam War, the government learned its lesson. The lesson they learned was not to publicize what they were doing. All of the wars after that, Bob Woodward wrote a book called Veil about the
secret wars of the CIA,
the small guerrilla wars.
Yep.
Fought by the CIA slush funds, where they would go in, destabilize the government, then go in and liberate the country, take over the government. It happened in Chile, it happened in Grenada, it happened in lots of countries in South America, it happened in Africa. What this means is that the government learned to change its tactics, but not to change its method, okay? And we got into trouble in a lot of places. They would get in and try to get out. That's been the history of what the government learned from that situation. Now, they also turned around and internalized those policies in terms of treating the internal population as a disenchanted population to be internally disorganized. More disinformation, more CIA, and the assault from the press on internal movements started with, well, they really started back in the labor movement in the late 20s, but it really got going here. This is an important phrase to comprehend. With the speed of information being gathered and disseminated by both legitimate and illegitimate organizations, it became clear to the right wing and their supporters very quickly that it was possible around the time of the Kent State massacre to reinterpret history while it was happening. They could choose to point the camera where they wanted and give it a background title that supported that narrative. They would point a camera at totally innocent students and say that these students were waiting to bomb a building. That was the narrative. And they would always point the camera at the most wild-haired, wild person. I can tell you this for a fact, and then I will move to the current situation. At no time in the entire anti-war movement was a leaflet put out by the left wing ever directly quoted so that people could hear what it was we actually had to say. It was always reinterpreted by somebody in a suit that worked in the front office who was the reason for the problem. And I saw that occur when I challenged a news reporter in a demonstration. I said, take this leaflet and quote it. He said, oh, I won't do that. I said, you don't have the courage. He did it. He showed up on the front line at a demonstration the next week. He had been fired by his own newspaper for quoting the actual words of the people who were demonstrating. And that's what that kind of process of reinformation, of rehashing the information became. It was a conscious campaign of reinterpreting history while it was happening. Donald Trump got into power as an inheritor of the benefits of that process and who we are today. That's what I got to tell you.
Joel Ice, I couldn't agree more. At Project Censored, I mean, that's been, sort of our main focus for over 40 years, is looking at the failures of the Fourth Estate, not because the reporters can't necessarily tell the truth, but because the owners don't let them, and they frame certain narratives, as you just suggested. So bringing this up to the present sounds like a really important lesson to learn. We're still except now we have images beaming at us from our phones, from our computers, right?
Who knew that Andy Warhol was the second coming? We're all famous for 15 minutes, right?
Well, I think it's down to 15 seconds or 280 characters now.
Right. Okay.
I think we've become even more myopically insignificant.
What is important here is there's a kind of syllogistic process. I used to be a school teacher. There's a syllogistic process in driving home a lesson in such a way that students then act on it. And we're all students of the world around us now. You can tell somebody that something's going to happen, then tell them it happened, then tell them what you told them. We had a good example the other day. One of the guys who was one of the supporters of the Open the Country Now movement was tested positive for COVID-19. Where's the lesson? The lesson is he was wrong. But you can't just leave it on the screen and left it unsaid. Somebody has to go on and say, this is what happens when you listen to these people. You can't assume people are going to understand it or people are going to act on it, because the kind of people who don't want to see that are going to say, well, that was just one guy, rather than, wait a minute, that's wrong. That leadership is doing this to us. You can't assume that they're going to make the connections that you make. What is happening, what is wrong with the progressive media today, among many other things, is that they presume that people will just get it because fact A and fact B are a contradiction. You have to get on the air and say something. When Donald Trump in a debate says something, the person across the table from him, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or anyone, has to say, my fact checkers just told me that's a lie. They have to actually say it on the air. And if you get 146 times, then they're in a position to say, you're looking at a liar. But they can't leave it unsaid. And that's the primary problem. The leftist movement in this country presumes that everybody will have the switches snapped closed in the right order, when most people are rationalizing away from that process because it's going to force them to do something. They don't want to do it. There's a price to freedom. They don't want to pay that price.
Yeah, well, information literacy is a really big issue. We certainly need not only more historical context and more historically literate citizens. We need to boost civic literacy as well. Do you see that as a potential vehicle forward? We've got a lot of work to do, whether it's in the schools or the media. Yeah. It seems like these are all very connected from past to present.
I don't think we can. I agree. Absolutely. We cannot merely count on people running for political office because they are worried about their legacy. They're being paid by somebody. They are grooming themselves within the context of a fairly, relatively, safe environment. It's going to be much more up to people to pressure them to be clearer within the electoral situation, and certainly for local candidates who can speak more freely to be much more progressive. What I found in my many years as a labor organizer, as a draft counselor, and as a school teacher, is to say to a person in a conversation at the end, what are you going to do about it? I want you cannot get up from the table without telling me what you are in fact going to do. And then you have to go back to them and check with them. If you want to get somebody to go to a meeting, you have to put them in the car and take them to the meeting. You cannot presume they're going to show up, because they're not, because nobody's pressuring them. Once they come to the meeting and they become personally invested in the issues, then they're there. It's kind of like, the first one was free. You got them mainlined, but you have to actually take the trouble as an organizer to get them into the meeting, for them to see that, yes, this does affect me. I'm not a leaflet. I'm a person with a life. And this is affecting my life. So we have to do more after we have done the media.
Yeah, and not just get on here the ironies of us being on Zoom and using this kind of technology now, right? Which is a useful tool, but it's also potentially distracting. We can't just have people on social media and doing these kinds of posts and tweets and so forth.
Yes.
You've got to physically show up somewhere and have meetings and actually do something.
Good. Here's an interesting point. We have to. I don't know how to do this. I mean, I took a master's degree, a second master's degree, in what's called the artist-audience relationship, where you talk about how to put a strategy into a piece of artwork so that the public will get it, either a work in theater or a painting or a sculpture, performance art, all that stuff. We have to come up with ways to use the current tools to personalize and actualize, with a big A, what we're doing. Suppose, for example, we did a demonstration where there were 1 million of us 6 feet apart. Can you imagine the size of the geographic area those people would cover and what that would look like from the air. Now, where do you find a place large enough to show that many people objecting to, Trump or the governor of Georgia or whatever? So we have to find tools where we all take our cell phones and hold them up at the person, who doesn't want to hear us, and turn up the volume so it becomes a roar. We've got to get a truck with large speakers, big truck, Phil Spector's wall of sound, 194 speakers, big JBL 7s or VOT speakers, crank those mothers up and take out the windows. They have to know we're here, and even if it's one guy with a truck with 10 speakers on it, 10 guys, each with a truck with 10 speakers on it, they have to know we're here. And it's going to take getting people to realize they're going to have to get out of their comfort zone or nothing is going to change,
Well, Joel Ice, we certainly have movements, not citing someone like Bernie Sanders as a leader of said movements, but there's an awful lot of young people that really, very diverse people of all backgrounds behind, that's a whole genesis of things going right back to the period of 1970. I mean, these are remnants of people that are demanding social justice, whether it's Occupy or Dreamers or Black Lives Matter.
Right.
We're all out there, right? We just have to kind of figure out how do we do it together and amplify the signal.
I think it's important to begin as early as possible in any dialogue talking about possible things to do, and before that conversation is over, say, okay, which of these are we in fact going to actually do? And then I've got my calendar open. When are we going to do it? And that has to become a modus in the conversation. It's like at the end of the conversation, every Catholic does this. At the end of the conversation, every leftist says, now what? What do you do? That has to become what we say all the time, and pin people down to a strategy that they're going to show up. What is it Woody Allen said? 75% of life is just showing up, So I think that it's important to do that. It's crucial. I mean, it's an issue of survival. We can't think somebody else is going to do it. We can't say, oh, we were all out on the street on Saturday in a pink hat. That'll show them. Won't show them anything. They're not looking. They don't want to hear it. And they're going to show up. They're going to show up with rifles.
Well,
They're going to show up with rifles. I mean, the other thing that Kent State showed us was that, and Jackson State and all the civil rights demonstrations and the thing at San Francisco State, is they're willing to shoot you down. This is a revolution. They're willing to shoot you down. The only thing you can do at that moment in time is everybody lay down right away. So there's so many bodies in the street, you get a visual image of dead people that aren't dead yet. They point a gun at you, lay down, which means that all of a sudden the government goes, people who are watching that on television go, my God, all of those people could be dead. Are they going to shoot somebody who's lying down? Because they're all trained not to shoot somebody in the back.
Well,
that has to be what you do.
Yeah. So in other words, again, back to another leftist axiom, right? There's theory and praxis.
Amen. Amen.
Exactly. And action.
That's
right. Joel Ice, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to share your thoughts from not just from 1970, but the relevance of Kent State now. We really appreciate you participating in this project.
Please give my love to all the other people you talk with who may or may not know me or know of me. I'd be interested in talking to them. They can email me if they like. I did complete a memoir on all of this that's gotten good support. David Harris has read it and loves it. Peter Coyote read it and loved it. Laurel Krauss has read it and loved it. A couple other major writers have liked that. So I'm very interested in getting that out. That's a personal plug, but I would like to communicate and work more with more people that you will talk with. And you and I, we'll continue in this.
Oh, absolutely, Joel. To be continued.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Be well.
You too. please introduce yourselves for our viewers and listeners.
DeRay McKesson, civil rights activist. I was one of the original protesters in Ferguson, and I continued the work around ending police violence.
So thanks so much for agreeing to participate in our series of conversations as we approach here as we are at the 50th anniversary and commemoration of the Kent State Massacre, which took place May 4, 1970. Now, DeRay, you obviously weren't born at that time. You were not at Kent State, but your work clearly it comes out of a long tradition of protesting against state violence, police violence, for civil rights, and so forth. So what kind of lessons might you think that Kent State has for us today, sort of a trajectory historically? I know you can connect that to a lot of things that have gone on in the last 5 to 10 years as well.
You know, it's interesting when I think about Kent State, I remember learning about Kent State on a really surface level before I sort of dove into activism in this way. And it was 4 students get killed by the National Guard for pushing back against the government's intervention in Vietnam and a host of other social ills. And it made me think about 2 things. One is that when we think about like the long trajectory of civil rights, we've actually gotten a lot of wins. Housing, desegregation, education, health, like definitely not where we want to be, but a lot of wins. The police is actually one of the only institutions that is as bad or worse than when the fight started. So like National Guard isn't any more respectful of people's lives. The police aren't any more respectful of people. Like it is sort of the same. The numbers are the same. Like it is still sort of wild. Even when we think about this moment of COVID, it's like we just did analysis and the rate of police violence in March of 2020 is the same as it was in March of 2019. So even with the lockdown, shutdown, like the police behavior is largely unchanged. So when I think about Kent State, I think about what it means that we see young people rise up. We see young people take action. We see young people unarmed, only armed with the truth, standing in streets and saying like, this is unacceptable and being met with sheer violence, right? The second is I'm like just in awe of how something that happened in the 70s is essentially still happening today. That the violence of the police and the police apparatus is as consistent as anything we've ever seen.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. A couple of the other conversations I've had with people that were active at the time, they made those striking connections, right? And saying that there's still a struggle, right? There's still something that we collectively need to do together, act together, particularly around state violence. And as the COVID, you mentioned COVID-19, COVID is giving another cover for, you just said, even though despite the fact that we're allegedly sheltering in place or quarantining, you just said that police violence has gone on unabated, right? This is definitely a thread, a characteristic of our state, of our society, that we maybe haven't learned a lot of lessons from. So kind of going back to Kent State, Jackson State, 50 years later, what, DeRay, could you possibly say about the current political and human rights struggle that we are still dealing with, and what can we be doing about it, particularly maybe at a time during COVID? You showed great success in social media organizing, out of Ferguson because the corporate media wasn't telling those stories. Talk to us about that, some of your experiences and ideas for people to be more involved.
I think that if there's any sort of the macro lesson I learned in the street in St. Louis and then in all the other places that followed was that there's this myth of what it means to be an organizer. There's this myth, there's like a really academic understanding that says that the only people who organize are people who have read all the theory, they have been to 15 workshops, and it's like, let me tell you, when we were in the street in St. Louis, none of us were steeped in organizing theory. None of us were steeped in, but what we often say is that people have the experiences before they had the language. We knew what abolition was because we knew what it meant in our lives before we had the language of abolition. We knew what intersectionality was with our lives before we had the language of it. But there's a way that dominant culture even reinforces itself amongst marginalized communities that says that the only way to really be real, the only way to be validated is to have the language around these things. And if there's anything I've learned in COVID, is just another reminder, is that people have the innate skills to organize already. They do. People didn't need 15 workshops and 3 documentaries to be like, oh, the elderly person next to me probably needs some food, right? Like people didn't people didn't need the NAACP or any national organizing group to come to St. Louis and say, you know what, I think it's unacceptable that they not only killed Mike Brown, but left his body in the street for 4.5 hours. Like, we didn't need critical essays about that to take action. So that's one, is that people have the skills. Part of our work as people who organize is to help people unlock those skills. The second is like, what does it mean to organize? Is that organizing at its root is always grounded in structural change, like systemic change. There are a lot of other things that are really good. Mobilizing, programming, activism, protest, all that is great. If it doesn't lead, if the end goal isn't some structural change, then like it's not organizing. And that's not like a bad thing. It just is like is what it is, right? The third thing is that when I think about the police, one of the things that we realized in 2015 was that if we focus on these singular moments of trauma, we'll never win. Because the worst or like the most intense consequence that'll come out of a singular moment of trauma will be accountability for the officer. That is sort of like the thing that happens with the police. There's some other things that like, you know, we get one missing white kid and then all of a sudden we have a whole Amber Alert, right? But like with the police, because the police normally terrorize people of color, it's like one just never is like enough to change the landscape. And, you know, it's this push about how do we make sure that we don't let people confuse accountability and justice? That accountability is what happens after the trauma. Justice is the idea that the trauma shouldn't exist in the first place, right? It's why we double down on so much of the data and understanding the rules and understanding the policies and laws, because we were like, yeah, we could totally stand in the street again when somebody gets killed, but like we've just never, that's never changed the structure, right? Like that, it just hasn't. And that's something that I'm always mindful of. The last thing I'll say is that since the protests in 2014, the police have killed more people, not less. Didn't get better, got worse. The only bright spot is that there's actually been a statistically significant decrease in cities. And it's been an increase everywhere else. But the places that have had a decrease, there's been structural change. Like that is like what has happened. It wasn't random. There's been like sustained pressure that either we moved out a set of leaders or we changed some rules and policies, but something at the structural level happened that made this possible.
Yeah, and it's also, you know, at Project Censored, we cover a lot of stories that folks in certain communities, certainly marginalized communities, may be aware of, as you said, through lived experiences. But the corporate media don't give them any kind of frame or a platform, and they either ignore these stories or they tend to frame or flip them around and tell a very backwards or very distorted kind of story versus the one that you literally see on the ground when you're living those experiences. And so, you know, history matters, and you know, we need to learn a lot of the lessons from the 1960s and 70s. It seems 50 years later, here we still are in the midst of an empire, military excursions abroad, more and more violence at home. So in some senses, you know, that feedback loop has continued. And you mentioned, you mentioned reform or structural changes that have diminished police violence. And then at the same token, 50 years later, after COINTELPRO, we still have the FBI targeting what they called Black identity extremists as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. So in a lot of ways, that system hasn't, the overarching system on the federal level really hasn't changed, but on the local level, maybe it has. DeRay, could you talk at all about maybe a couple of the instances, the really good news stories where you've seen some of these kinds of changes or reforms or civilian oversight committees or reduced use of force in police precincts and so forth? Can you address anything that you think that has been working, you know, to stem that tide at all?
Yeah, so you think about, so we did some work in Austin with the organizers in Austin who are incredible, and they were working really hard on changing some aspects of the police union contract. So in Austin, there was like this rule that there was a very small window from when an officer did something to you when you could report it. And that was like the thing that they used to organize. And they pushed and pushed. And eventually, you know, we were there that night. The city council unanimously voted against the police union contract, which had never, ever happened in Austin. The organizers got a seat at the table when it came to actually negotiating. So it's like you saw all of a sudden, it wasn't momentary, but they were like, how do we actually insert ourselves into the way the rules are mapped out? Same thing's actually happening in Portland right now, which is really powerful. Oakland had some really aggressive changes to the way the police can use force in communities. And again, this is not to say that the police in these communities aren't still wreaking havoc in many ways, but it is to say that when we think about police violence, normally when people say police violence, they think about violence that results in death, right? Partly because that is like where the best data is. So we know that sexual assault is happening. We know that verbal assault, we know that a host of other things are happening, and we never are diminishing those. We just don't have a lot of data on those. So we can't like quantify it in the way that we can quantify death. So in places like Oakland, police violence that results in death is just down. It's dramatically down. This doesn't mean that there aren't other forms of police violence that are actually really prevalent in community, but we have focused so heavily on like keeping people alive. We also track a lot of rules and policies around the country, and you'd be shocked at how many people are afraid of sort of addressing the police. So like California has a law that says that any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline regardless of the outcome. That is wild, right? And a lot of people don't know that. And you know, who controls the investigations? The police. So if they want to ride it out, make it a year and a day, a year and 2 days, like they automatically kill the investigation. That is, there. You can love the police and that doesn't make sense, right? In Oregon, the law says that an officer can use deadly force if they think you just committed a felony or if they think you're about to commit a felony. What? Yeah, right, so we spend a lot of time in communities, like even with lawmakers and like deciphering what the rule is, you know?
I think it's really good that you point that out. You're here in Northern California, Santa Rosa. I'm sure you're familiar with the shooting of the 13-year-old Andy there several years ago, and it led to some movements to try to get oversight in the police commission. And it's very the community's been very resistant. Certainly, the police force been very resistant. But I'm very I'm glad that you pointed out that a lot of folks in society don't really know the rules by which the police investigate themselves. And so when the sheriff comes out and says that officer so-and-so didn't commit any wrongful act, to observers from the outside, it just looks completely venal and corrupt. But when you actually go in and look at what their own guidelines and rules are, they're technically correct by the way that they enforce their own rules. And that's something that more people really need to understand in order to affect change. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. And, you know, I know way more about, I'm an expert on the police now in a way that I was not before. And you'd be shocked. There are things like, you know, what do you think it means when the police say they solved a case? What do you think that means? Like, what are the actions that go into solve?
Well, it sounds like that they've come to some resolution or they've figured something out and made a determination about it.
So in every city across the country, solve just means that they made at least one arrest.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they arrested the right person. Doesn't mean that it was a conviction. Right. So there's so much about the policing apparatus that people like really don't know. So like, you know, what I will hear is people like, oh, the police solve crimes, they keep communities safe. You're like, well, they are, even the metric that they use is really low, right? Like in a lot of major cities, the solve rate is like 30%, which means that they didn't even think they found somebody for the majority of the cases. And they don't even track conviction data because that is so low, right? So like, it's actually not happening in the way people think it's happening. So that's a part of it. The second is that, and you talk about the reason that stories matter, is that so much of this is like not only helping people understand the structure, like the way sort of rules and policies work, but also the structure of the way we've been conditioned to think about these apparatus. So like, you know, I'll ask people to tell me a place where you feel the most safe. Like just think, you don't have to tell me, but think of a place where you feel safe, where you feel the most safe. You got it? Mm-hmm. Are the police there?
No, they are not. They're nowhere near.
Yeah. So when we think about what safety means, we are saying, how about we get all the things that were in that place where you felt safe? That's what everybody deserves. That place that you got in your mind that was safe for you was probably a place where there was food, shelter, family, people who love you, like, that is what makes communities safe. It's not the presence of the police, right? That the police at their best normally get there after the bad things already happen, right? We want to create a world where the bad things don't happen.
Well, that's an incredible vision. And certainly looking back at our history, we really need to learn those lessons. Do you have any more parting advice for us, for our viewers, listeners, as we're looking back 50 years of what happened at Kent State, Jackson State? We've got a lot of work cut out for us. You shared a lot of your wisdom with your book from a couple of years back. If people aren't familiar, with that, they could certainly learn a lot from your work. Your book was on the other side of freedom. Your website. You want to give your website for folks so they can maybe learn more? And
yeah, it's just DeRay@DeRay.com, DERAY. And that's my email address. My email address is DeRay@DeRay.com. The website is just DeRay.com, DERAY.com. I think the only lesson I'll say is I'm always mindful of who becomes a casualty of these sort of situations. It's always the people with the least amount of power. It's students who are just like outside. It's the poorest people who are in the street, who their bodies are used as disposable things by the state in ways that we know are unacceptable. But I'm also shocked at how quickly people forget. So part of our work is to keep things alive. Like I even think about Ferguson, we were all alive for that. It was not too long ago. And the number of people who don't remember us being in the street for 400 days is still wild to me. People talk to us like we were in the street for like 2 weekends. It's like, it was a long 400 days, And I never want people to forget like the cost of it. And I will hear people say things like, oh, I just couldn't come, I couldn't make it. And it's like, neither could we, right? None of us could make it. All of us sacrificed something. All of us gave up it was easier for all of us to stay home. So I'm not really interested in like you telling me you couldn't come. What is true is you didn't come. And I'm okay with that, right? But don't make it sound like you had way more to lose than everybody else and therefore you didn't. And I think about all the young people at Kent State, Jackson, all these people who like, it would have been so much easier for them to stay home, to stay in the dorm, to go home, to phone it in, and they chose not to. And part of our work is to always honor that. Like honor the people who in the moment where they had to make a tough decision, they made it. They didn't like explain it away. They didn't rationalize. They made the choice, and I'll always stand by people who make the choice.
Well, DeRay McKesson, thanks so much for your advice, for sharing your thoughts, and thanks so much for your activism. It's actually just part of your everyday existence, part of your life. And I think maybe if all of us, kind of take that advice that you just gave and show up, right? Show up and be part of those things that happen. We can maybe make more of those larger structural changes that we're still looking for. So thanks so much for your time and your work, DeRay.
Cool, thank you. Good to be here, and see you later.
Take care.
I'm David Swanson. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm the executive director of World Beyond War, the campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. I'm on the advisory board of Veterans for Peace, and I'm engaged with various peace and justice organizations.
So, David Swanson, thank you so much for joining us for this Kent State 50th teach-in. We know you're really busy and you do a lot of great work around social justice issues, as you were just describing some of those. And we were just asking people a few basic questions, broad questions about the Kent State massacre of May 4, 1970. And even though you and I either weren't born yet or were only 1 or 2 years old, we certainly don't have concrete memories of May 4, 1970. But what does May 4, 1970, the shootings that took place at Kent State, what do those mean to you historically?
Yeah, well, I must have been about 5 months old at the time. I have no memory of it, but I have some knowledge of having worked with some of the people like Laurel who are still trying to get the truth of what happened and hold people accountable and teach the right lessons from this particular incident today. And I think the memory of it and the history of what happened coming out of it are still very relevant today. I think it was an example that shocked some people at the time, even more so than Jackson State and other similar tragedies, because they saw the U.S. government, for whatever justification, shooting the people who matter rather than the people who do not matter. And you see a similar, dawning light bulbs going off in people's heads in some cases with the current coronavirus pandemic. They will literally say, the mayor of Las Vegas will sacrifice the citizens of her city as an experiment to see how many people die. The Congress members from Indiana and lieutenant governor from Texas. So we'll kill people as long as we get the economy going, which is how the U.S. government has always, and before the U.S. government was even a government, has talked about Native Americans and African Americans and, the 95% of the world that's outside of the United States. But to have them, so recklessly, casually, sadistically almost deal with the lives of the people who matter, the people who supposedly all the justifiable, glorious, mass murder abroad and elsewhere and in the wrong neighborhoods is for the benefit of. I think that shocks people. But I think, I don't think we're terribly likely to see an exact duplicate of what happened at Kent State today. I think they've, both sides have varied their tactics considerably. And the powers that be have long since learned not to attract the media. In fact, to get rid of the media is a far better tactic than shooting people, which hurts their cause. Now, there are people on the side of peace and justice who haven't learned that throwing rocks at windows hurts their cause. Everybody has to learn this lesson at some point. But for the most part, I think the people giving orders to the National Guard have long since learned what is counterproductive for their agenda.
Indeed. A lot of lessons seem to be learned by the establishment coming out of Vietnam, and you mentioned the press for sure. As we saw that, as we went through the Iraq wars and the Tommy Franks line that we don't do body counts and we embed reporters, we don't want to let the wrong stories get out.
Right.
A lot of lessons, I would suggest more cynical lessons that had been learned from that period. But David Swanson, how do you see the Kent State massacre in 1970 influencing the collective then to now in terms of, you mentioned shifts and how, quote, both sides operate. How do you see Kent State sitting historically as part of our collective consciousness and memory of who we are as a society?
I think it plays a big role, and through music and drama and art, it's played a particularly big role in people's memory of that era and in the role that the peace movement back here in the United States played in opposing and eventually ending the war on Vietnam, which, we now sort of have a very, very limited understanding in the general U.S. public of what happened in Vietnam. Almost nobody has, remotely within orders of magnitude, an idea of how many people were killed on each side and what happened and why. But people do have a sense that the war ended in part because of what the Vietnamese did, in part because of what the U.S. troops did, deserting, resisting, fragging, etc., and in part because of what the public did back in the United States, that the peace movement had a major impact in combination with other justice movements and the impeachment of Nixon movement and so forth. And people remember that, and people remember that and are aware of that, even if they've been so brainwashed that they're completely unaware of any other successes or victories in the peace. You could go back in recent years and point out to people the instances where there was a huge demand for a war on Iran, and people stopped it, and nobody knows, and nobody credits themselves with having, or there was going to be an all-out carpet bombing of Syria 7 years ago. Didn't happen. And everybody just sort of looks back to the Vietnam period. Something got done, and then Bush wanted to attack Iraq, and we said no, and we failed, and Iraq got attacked anyway, and we are powerless, and we should crawl under our beds and slit our throats. And the fact that war was made illegal, that the United Nations was moved, that numerous nations were moved, that the public was moved, that it was made so shameful that all you had to say to Congress members in the decades after was, you launch this next war, you're going to be that jerk who voted for another Iraq. And it was, hanging around their neck like an albatross. And, so I think the Vietnam peace era has taught people the correct lesson that the peace movement can do something, but it's taught people all kinds of incorrect lessons about what that must look like, to the point where you have the Democrats in Congress trying to create draft registration for women as an equal right, a feminist demand for the equal right to be forced against your will to go kill and die for ExxonMobil. And I'd say the number two in the size groups of support. I mean, the top supporters are the pro-war liberals, right? And the top opponents are the backward, right-wing, sexist, keep the barefoot women in the kitchen people. But in between, I think the second biggest group of supporters are the Vietnam era peace activists, who believe that you must have a draft to end a war, and that a draft is an anti-war measure, which is disproved by decades of history in nations around the world. And getting a war that kills 6 million people, or probably more in the current age, in order to have a larger peace movement, is actually not a trade-off I'm looking for as a peace activist. So, Vietnam has these images of Kent State and of draft resistance that have taught us some lessons and some misunderstandings as well.
I think that that's really a good point that you're making, because we are seeing that again, right? We saw it in the mid 2000s during the W. Bush years. There were movements in Congress to bring back the draft as a way to end the war, right? And now we're seeing what you just suggested again. So I think what a lot of us forget, or never learned perhaps some of the lessons from that period, that a lot of people really fought. The part of the anti-war movement was to end the draft. Stop the whole thing.
Well, see, now the courts have ruled that it's unconstitutional to just register men and not women. So you've actually got a bill in Congress that would abolish the selective service for everybody. That would treat women equally with men. You get rid of this barbaric practice. But you've also got a different bill that would expand draft registration to women, and, oh, by the way, expand junior ROTC and military recruitment and all this other militaristic structure, while wrapping it all in, non-military volunteer service programs in the Peace Corps and AmeriCorps, and, involuntary, participation in war becomes just another voluntary humanitarian service program. Very deceptive and insidious sort of legislation that I very much hope is not going to go anywhere. But, we don't have the sort of support, even from peace activists, in opposing it, that we should.
Well, I think getting the word out that this is happening is key. I certainly know that you do your part in that regard, but it doesn't seem to be part of the national conversation, unfortunately. And now with the coronavirus and COVID-19, that's sort of blanketed almost, or put a lens through which we're looking at everything that's happening. Of course, one thing that could come out of that lens would be, it puts into perspective how completely senseless a lot of these wars are in the first place. One would hope that lens would be there.
If you can scale back the weapons shows and the war rehearsals because you don't want the troops to get sick or become ill, why do you need to start them up again afterwards? If you can have a global ceasefire, and I know it's not been realized yet, and it's not complete, and it's an extravaganza of hypocrisy where every government wants a ceasefire for everyone else on earth, but not them. But if you, to the extent that we're getting a ceasefire, if you can end these wars, why in the world start them up again? Right? If they're this inevitable force of nature that you shouldn't bother trying to stop, but then you can stop them because there's this other crisis to be dealt with. And what do you make of all the last resort language that started them in the first place? Obviously, something's not a last resort if all it takes is a distraction to put an end to it, right? And yet, we actually, thus far, have seen increased military spending, increased militarism, and in some cases, increased fighting and bombing during this pandemic. And a lot of the increased spending, including in the United States, is, panic in face of the fear that the pandemic is going to reduce spending by maybe next year. We will see. But as of now, we've got, weapons production, people working in weapons factories in the United States labeled essential workers. Essential to what? We got a shortage of food workers, we got a shortage of health workers, we got a shortage of people aiding those suffering because of this pandemic, and we're treating weapons production for dozens of dictatorships and so-called democracies around the globe, not just for the sainted US government, as essential, right? And so we have to have this moment actually be the shift that logically it ought to be, where we start really thanking doctors and nurses and farmers and food workers for their service, and stop thanking people for a service over something that's actually a murderous crime rather than a service. We have to shift from seeing weapons production and mass murder and mass destruction as essential to anything, and start envisioning what a department or agency of actual defense would look like. It was actually defending against real dangers like nuclear apocalypse, like climate collapse, like these spin-off pandemics that come from these policies.
I remember Dennis Kucinich talking about a Department of Peace, for example.
Yeah, if we had a department that actually worked on peace and could somehow compete with the Department of War that's labeled the Department of Defense, and the State Department that's a sidekick of the Department of War and so forth, we would really be getting somewhere. And this is a moment to try it, where we're seeing some real change in environmental policies. And we're certainly seeing change in rhetoric around war. But we've got such a societal problem with acceptance of war that everyone's talking about the coronavirus as a war enemy.
It's a war metaphor, right? We never seem to grow tired of the war metaphor. Robin Anderson just wrote about this at FAIR. Andrew Austin's written about it. It's something that we can't seem to escape. We declare war on everything, including the virus.
Absolutely. I mean, on one and the same day, I read an article proposing that NATO declare war on the coronavirus, and another article declaring that NATO was the top candidate for the next Nobel Peace Prize. Right. So this is the sort of madness that we're living in, and we have this government that, as soon as you hit it with a real threat, with a pandemic that causes actual damage, it collapses, immediately is revealed as a naked emperor, as a clownish Keystone Cop, corrupt, incompetent, buffoonish circus. So how is it that same government has been so professionally and awe-inspiringly holding off the Russian and Iranian and North Korean and Venezuelan menaces? Well, because they aren't real. Because it's easy to constantly defeat imaginary threats, right? Venezuela's military budget is something like 0.0001% of the U.S. The Iran's is approaching 1% of the U.S. Russia's is about 8%. China's is 30% or so of the U.S. budget, and predictably goes up whenever the U.S. does, and down whenever the U.S. does. But these are imaginary threats; they're not real threats, and we've got to stop this worshipful, troop obsessed, flag obsessed, music and weaponry obsessed reverence for these buffoons who can't handle a simple health crisis. They aren't handling the evil Iranians who are about to kill us all if Donald Trump weren't there to save us. The Iranians just want to be left the hell alone and aren't threatening anybody and never were. So this is what we have to try to realize.
Yeah, neoliberalism is certainly laid bare, right? The COVID crisis has laid bare the failures of neoliberal policies over the last half century plus. You've already pretty much been going into the final question, so just want to just put it out there again and see if you had anything else you wanted to add to it. Been asking everybody who's been participating about making peace with the massacre at Kent State, and of course that means different things to different people. And so there's been very different responses about what elements of it they make peace with, elements of it about which they don't believe they should be making peace with. But bringing it up more to the present in that regard, after 9/11, now during this pandemic, as you mentioned, just like our government hasn't stopped the military-industrial complex, we haven't seen an abatement of the trouncing of human rights, of civil rights, particularly on marginalized communities. So, maybe moving it forward from Kent 50 years later, what are some things maybe that you could, how would you define maybe making peace with that and addressing the current challenges we face?
Well, a word or a phrase can mean a million different things to a million different people, as you said. And if making peace with something means something important to someone, I have no, disagreement. But I don't have any interest myself in making peace with senseless murder. I would tend more to agree with Dr. King, who not too far in time away from that massacre suggested that we ought to be maladjusted to a society that is sick. We ought not to try to adjust ourselves or make peace with, we're living in what many people are increasingly recognizing as a permanent crisis headed toward a cliff. We've got environmental collapse approaching, if not beyond, the point of no return in various ways. And so talking about returning to normal from the coronavirus, when the normal is an absolutely insane, mass murderous, self-genocide, doesn't make any sense. I don't want to make peace with that. I want to make panic. I want to make fear. I want to make anger. I want to make engagement. I want to make energy. I want to make dedication. I want to make enthusiastic, nonviolent, strategic engagement with trying to transform the world. And so I love listening to this this little girl who's become this environmental leader, Greta Thunberg, who people tell her how they can help her be hopeful, and she tells them to shut up. I don't want to be hopeful. I don't want you to feel better. I want you to feel worse. I want you to help turn this world around before we destroy it.
Yeah,
well, that's what I want.
Yeah, you influence us to get busy. Just like, let's, again, not forgetting 50 years ago, these young people were protesting the imperial wars in Vietnam that killed between 3 and 4 million people. Just at the time, these people were shot for trying to literally throw their bodies on the gears of the machine, in other words, right? Going back to Savio. And that's what we need to be doing now. Would you say, David, we should be, we can't go out into the streets right now, right? But we really need to pick this up and not return to the normal that you just described.
Yeah, they were right. They were right, and their victory is not complete. And if we don't hurry up and complete it, we're done for. It's not optional, right? We understand now, if anyone didn't then, and I think many did, that if we don't kick the militarism habit and we don't stop the extraction and consumption and destruction of the earth, we're done for. So it's not a choice. It's not a style. It's not a fashion preference. It's not a counterculture I want to be hip with. it's an absolute necessity for survival. And if you don't like the fact that about many things the peace activists and the hippies were right, deal with it. It doesn't matter, who agree, with whether you like someone who agrees with you on an important point or not. It remains an important point. We have to develop a culture of peace and sustainability with regard to planet Earth, or we're not going to survive. And the people protesting, the people who were shot at Kent State, were on the right side of that struggle.
Well, David Swanson, it's always good to catch up with you, and you always have a lot to offer in terms of perspective. And even though, like, we started this conversation, you and I were either really, really, really little or not around yet at all when Kent State happened, yet those lessons from history are more important maybe now than ever for us, as you just pointed out, that we really need to be turning the ship around, and we don't necessarily have a lot of time to do it.
I agree.
So, David Swanson, thanks so much for joining us for the Kent State 50th teach-in.
Thanks, Mickey. Same to you.
Hi, I'm Laurel Krause. I'm Allison Krause's sister. She was one of 4 students killed at Kent State. And I'm really happy to participate in this Kent State 50th teach-in. Do you have some questions, Mickey?
I do, Laurel. Thanks so much for being a big part of this Kent State 50th teach-in. And looking forward to you sharing your very, very important thoughts and experiences. The first of the questions, and these are bigger, broader questions, as you know, what does May 4th, 1970 mean to you? And of course, what is your memory of that fateful day?
Well, as I mentioned, my sister, Allison, she was my older sister. She was 19, an honor student at Kent State. And I was 15. I learned about it getting off the school bus, going home. And that moment really changed my life. It was a childhood event. And at 15, when things like that happen, it kind of changes your life forever. And this did mine. It also instilled in me a lifelong goal of finding truth at Kent State and fighting for my sister. I raised my fist when she died. That's what it meant to me. But it also meant a lot to my family. It wasn't just me personally. My parents took Kent State to the courts. And it was a very hard battle because the courts were very closed to seeking truth and accountability when it was matters related to the government. And my father actually had to take it all the way to the US Supreme Court to get the right to sue the state of Ohio related to the killing of 4 and wounding of 9 at Kent State. And he won. And Ohio was a sovereign state. And so my father's victory, my father, Arthur Krause, his victory was to be able to bring suit and ask for accountability from the governor and all the people in the state. They weren't above the law. And this changed the laws for all sovereign states across America, not just Ohio. So that was probably about the biggest thing we ever got out of our search for truth and accountability at Kent State. I've had the opportunity to take it to the United Nations in 2014. And so I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in our family. We're all interested in truth and accountability, especially when it's related to wrongful acts, massacre acts of the government.
That's a pretty serious story and a series of events that really shaped a lot of your life and your family's life, and seeking justice for what happened at Kent State. So the next question is, how has the May 4, 1970 Kent State massacre influenced the collective then and now? And again, since I know that this has been such a really big part of your life and your struggle for justice.
Well, what we found when we were seeking truth and accountability at Kent State was that the government didn't want us seeking truth and accountability at Kent State, and they were doing everything in their power to stop us. And so for the 10 years following the Kent State massacre, when my father was suing the government and 9 years of litigation, ended up with $15,000 in a statement of regret. And it was a phony statement of regret on top of it, and the $15,000 was really more of a slap in the face than any type of acknowledgement that is what a life is worth. Because obviously $15,000 for my sister's life, I mean, how ridiculous. But anyhow, we became targets of the government because we sought truth and accountability at Kent State. And Kent State seems to be it's like an Achilles heel of government wrongdoings. It's blatantly obvious that the massacre was perpetrated by the government. My sister was killed by a government bullet. Let that sink in. A government bullet. And it's just never been about the Kent State story that the government did it. It's never, we're not allowed to, because the media is trained, and those who train the media, which my theory is these days it's the CIA, that's what they think their job is. And now they've perpetrated all the cable media with all these security analysts that are interpreting the news for us, and all the defense people. Anyhow, we get the world through the TV and news. It's about war and propagating war and supporting war, and not about someone like my sister Allison, who stood for peace and against the war, and actually protested against the war and got gunned down while she was protesting against the war. And oh, by the way, that's criminal. A government isn't allowed to kill a protester. No. No. And when they do, because they do, then they have to follow certain procedures. They have to do a higher level of credible investigation. None of that has happened in Kent State. No, we're not allowed that. No, that we're not allowed nice things. No, no. They have to do certain actions to make amends. The opposite of that has been true. Just take a look at what's going on at the 50th. Not one word of amend, not one word of apology, not one word of, we shouldn't have done this. And 4 people died. And the other 9, that was attempted murder or target assassination, as they say at the United Nations. So how does it affect now? What happened to my family back then is like we had them on our telephones, they were in our mailboxes, they were threatening us. We got threats in the mail from J. Edgar Hoover himself. I know that's true, I mean, this is that they went to offering millions of dollars for us to, get off of our lawsuits. And my father said, I'm not interested in money. We've never been interested in the money. It's not about the money. And that's the problem here, because in America, it's always about the money. So as we watch this, back then we were just treated like dirt, and every element of our lives was under examination, and there were teams of people coming after us. Not just us, of course. This is anyone that seeks accountability for things like Kent State. There's long lists of people like this that the government has, and so we were under the microscope, you know, with you know, government people, you know, causing trouble in our lives, big trouble. My father's job was threatened, and so then, you know, so that happened to us. But it wasn't happening to other people. Well, now it's happening to everybody. That's the concept of now. It's now we get, now everyone gets that USA Patriot Act treatment that we got back, in 1970. And I'm sorry for everybody, but maybe, I think people should band together and not be as willing to give up their freedom as they have been.
Well, Laurel Krauss, that leads us to the third and final question, and maybe the most difficult one, but I think maybe also the most poignant and significant for us now. How do we make peace with the Kent State massacre? And I say that in historical context. After momentous events like September 11th, and here we are in the midst of doing this commemoration, seeking truth at Kent State 50 years later, because of this COVID-19 pandemic. And so we were all supposed to be at Kent with you. You invited me to come and speak with you and speak for your family, which is a great honor.
You were going to speak for my sister.
And I still will.
No.
But we won't be able to do it at Kent State, so that's why we put together this really important commemoration with so many people that were impacted, what happened at Kent. But what we've seen post 9/11 and now in this pandemic crisis, there's a relentless quest by the state to curtail our rights, our civil rights, political rights, human rights are under assault. And part of making peace with Kent State maybe helps us be more mindful, or maybe drives us into doing the things that we really need to be doing today. Laurel Krauss, could you speak to in any of those issues?
Kent State is a perfect example for us to learn from. If we would ever take off the blinders and look at it as it is, where it was a government action perpetrated against protesters and then immediately covered up and translated into something that wasn't. And it has been held for 50 years, and now the government is installing their historic reference of it, and here we go. And this is like how the government handles these things. So we have to do things like what you do, Mickey, with Project Censored, and just steadfastly demanding that we know the truth of these stories. And it's up to us. It's not up to the media. The media, the paid media, okay? They're paid off. Let's get real. Corporate owned, however it is, whether it's politically or, economically, it just is. And so to make peace, we have to go for the truth. But we also have to teach it. We have to teach that it's really important and that truth matters. And if we don't do that, I recently had a session with Emerson College, and the students there were talking to me, and they were saying, wow, I never learned Kent State, and I never learned about it. These kids, they never heard about it. They never learned about it. And they were pissed off. And they looked at me, they said, did you know this? And I said, listen, I've lived it. I mean, this story has been, censored since day one because it doesn't sit well. Hell, my sister said flowers are better than bullets the day before she was killed. The government doesn't like that story. So you're not going to find it at the 50th. And that is a big theme of the May 4th Kent State massacre, that my sister said that. And the next day that she was slaughtered by a bullet. I mean, that story is forgotten. It's conveniently forgotten by our government, by Kent State University, for those who want to foster this false narrative. And the false narrative, it stops us from healing. It stops us from ever dealing with the pain and coming to terms with it and making peace with it. If you have to have truth in order to have peace. And finally, my personal aim, my personal goal here is for the protection of protesters today. Whatever happened to my sister and her friends and every other protester that has faced government, horrible government violence and death, this must never happen again in America. It is highly illegal for the US government to be killing protesters. We're coming into a difficult time now. I have worries. I'm concerned. We have to stop this. And the only way that we do that is everyone that's a protester has to understand that they have protester rights. This is a broadband issue. It's what connects us all. Let's connect together and let's begin our movement anew.
Well, Laurel Krauss, couldn't agree more. History really matters, and the truth about history and getting the story right and hearing people's voices is really what it's all about. And I'm hopeful that this whole series of discussions and interviews that we're conducting, goes a long way into really pushing your ideas forward and pushing your hopes for a better, more just and peaceful world. So thank you very much, Laurel.
What I'm looking for is truth at Kent State, and maybe that will be included in the 50th story.
Well, we'll do our best to make sure it's there.
Thank you.